Have you ever noticed that at the top of society, people always seem to find common ground behind closed doors? Politicians who spend months attacking each other on television somehow manage to negotiate bipartisan legislation behind closed doors. Business competitors who publicly battle for market share still find ways to work together when their interests align. Or maybe world leaders who disagree on major issues continue meeting and negotiating and maintaining diplomatic relationships. Yet somehow, the rest of us are increasingly encouraged to believe that disagreement is absolute war. That if someone doesn't think exactly like we do, they must be our enemy. That compromise is weakness. That understanding another person's perspective is somehow surrender. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that we're making as a society. Because while many institutions profit from division, ordinary people pay the price for it. And honestly, it is as sad as it is disappointing. Now, I'm not saying let's join the madness of arguments that are absurd and degrade our society and let's all kumbaya together, right? Let's be clear about that. That's not what I'm talking about here. But today, I want to touch on an important topic, common ground. Why have we become so resistant to finding it? Who benefits when we don't? And why might finding common ground be one of the most important acts of independence left in modern society? In a previous episode, I talked about how culture wars have become a business or a business model. Conflict captures attention, outrage generates clicks, fear keeps people engaged, and engagement obviously, eventually translates into money. But the problem is that after a while, we start consuming conflict the same way that we consume entertainment. We begin seeing every disagreement as a battle to be won instead of a conversation to be had. And in a way, it gives us a sense of belonging to a team. But the truth is, if you're not profiting from that circus, then the chances are you're the one paying the price for it. Every issue becomes a referendum on identity. Every conversation becomes a test of loyalty. Every disagreement becomes personal. And when that happens, common ground becomes almost impossible to find. Not because it doesn't exist, but because we stopped looking for it. And trust me, the manufacturing machine never stops. It is a beast that must be fed daily. Social media has convinced many people that society is made up entirely of extremists. And while it might look like that in the surface, it is not entirely like that. Most people I encounter in real life, to me, they seem nuanced. They have complicated opinions. They agree with one side on some issues and the other side on others. They aren't walking political slogans. They're human beings. But nuance doesn't go viral. Outrage does. Compromise doesn't trend. Conflict does. And if we're not careful, we begin mistaking the loudest voices for the majority. When in reality, people just want to live their lives. Think about it. Nothing meaningful gets built without cooperation. Not a family, not a business, not a school, not a community, and certainly not a country. Every functioning institution depends on people finding common ground, even people who disagree. Especially, actually, people who disagree, because the irony is that the same society that depends on cooperation often rewards conflict the most publicly. But cooperation is what actually moves things forward, not endless arguments, not permanent outrage, not treating every single conversation like a battlefield. So let's think about it and analyze it. Why do we resist it? Well, because finding common ground requires something difficult. It requires humility. It requires accepting that we may not have all the answers. It requires listening and recognizing that intelligent people can arrive at different conclusions. And also, perhaps, most importantly, it requires separating disagreement from hatred. Somewhere along the way, we've confused those two things. And, we've started treating disagreement as evidence that someone is immoral, ignorant, or even dangerous. But disagreement has always existed. It is part of being human. The question isn't whether we disagree. The question is whether we can disagree without destroying our ability to coexist. And this is where I want to pull back the curtain for a moment, because behind the scenes, common ground is being found every single day. Think about it. Legislators negotiate. Businesses negotiate, communities negotiate, diplomats do too, even families negotiate. Life itself is one big long negotiation, yet somehow we're being constantly sold the idea that compromise is failure, that understanding another perspective is weakness, that coexistence is surrender. Don't buy it. Because if people running institutions understand the necessity of finding common ground, perhaps the rest of us should too. When you see many of these pundits in national television debating and going at each other's throats, they may disagree in public, but I can tell you from personal experience that when the cameras are off, many times they say to each other, hey, that was a great line that you had in your back pocket for that. But you don't see that at home. You're left believing that you should double down on your outrage over a particular topic, and that's not good. So maybe the challenge of our time isn't just choosing a side. Maybe it's refusing to become trapped in a permanent conflict like a hamster in a wheel, a conflict that benefits everyone except the people living in it. Maybe finding common ground isn't abandoning your principles and your values. Maybe it's about recognizing the humanity of people who don't share all of them. We can have disagreements, that's fine. A healthy disagreement makes for a healthy democracy. Let's remember that. But as we disagree, let's also have some grace for one another. Let's build one another up, not tear each other down. I know it sounds a bit utopian, but it is probably the biggest challenge we have ahead of us. And it is our responsibility to find common ground in situations that are challenging. I'll leave you with that.